There are so many bombshell revelations in the latest batch of Epstein files that it's hard to not feel overwhelmed when going over them. And of course, I can't offer you a comprehensive overview of everything that's in them, but we are going to dive into some lesser discussed stories here in a moment. But first, I do want to give you the biggest headline because I think it's important that we not bury the lead. Donald Trump, again, was named in the Epstein files. A lot. In fact, the New York Times reports that his name, as well as Melania's name and Mar-a-Lago, were referenced 38,000 times across 5,300 files. Notably, we learned last year that Epstein told Ghislaine Maxwell in a 2011 email that Trump spent hours alone with the victim at his house. More recently, we found out about a 2016 sworn testimony from an individual who claims that they witnessed Donald Trump threaten to make somebody disappear, just like a 12-year-old unnamed female disappeared. And he also threatened to have this individual's entire family killed if they, quote, ever disclosed any of the physical and sexual abuse of minor females that they'd witnessed Epstein or his clients commit. Mind you, they made this allegation under penalty of perjury, so that's something to keep in mind. There's also a plethora of tips to the FBI about Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, most of which aren't verified, but nonetheless, they accuse him of child sexual abuse and even say that he allegedly drugged and raped a woman. Now, we also learned that Epstein is the one who introduced Trump to Melania in the first place, so needless to say, there's a lot there, and we are barely scratching the surface. Now, when you piece together some of the clues from the Epstein files, it's reasonable to assume at the very least that Trump was well aware of Epstein's criminality and chose to keep quiet. But the more likely possibility is that Trump was a client of Epstein himself who allegedly engaged in child rape. But the connections between him and Epstein are so deep that I don't even think it's a stretch to question whether or not he was a co-conspirator who helped Epstein orchestrate the entire ring in the first place. But we don't know for sure, and we may never know the full extent of his possible culpability here. And he's not the only one who's implicated. And we know of certain names, but there are some names that the DOJ is choosing to redact where there is actual evidence that they did something wrong. For example, there's an email where somebody tells Epstein, "Thank you for the fun night. One of your littlest girls was the naughtiest," and they chose to keep that name from us. We need to know who wrote that email so they can be investigated. But nobody's been investigated. You know, in other countries, in the UK, Slovenia, and elsewhere, there's consequences, at least minimally. But in the US, people who've been named are just like saying, yeah, you know, I shouldn't have hung out with this guy who's a pedophile. I didn't know any better, but I didn't do anything wrong. I just, I hung around with bad people. But like, that's the extent of it. There's no accountability, no justice, nothing. Now, I just want to go through some of the names because, goddamn, it is baffling the amount of people here just across the political spectrum and throughout the world who have been named in these fucking files. It includes billionaires like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Richard Branson, just to name a few. Former presidents, as you now know, like Bill Clinton, Larry Summers, the former Harvard president who served in both the Clinton and Obama administrations. There's Alan Dershowitz, Howard Lutnick, Trump's current Commerce Secretary. There's people in media like Peter Attia of CBS News, who is a physician. And also, get this, we're learning because of the Epstein files that he ditched his family when his son was in the hospital to hang out with Jeffrey Epstein. And he talked about how he was addicted to Jeffrey Epstein and needed to get his fix of Jeffrey Epstein. And like all of the other people in these files, they all seem enamored with Jeffrey Epstein, more so than just like trying to get in good with him and blow smoke up his ass, but they were drawn to him in some inexplicable way that is very disturbing in my opinion. But that's not all. There's also once respected left-wing intellectuals like Noam Chomsky who have been named in the Epstein files. Not necessarily because there's evidence of wrongdoing, but because Chomsky was trying to help Epstein rehabilitate his image. Thanks, Noam. Now, there's also sports moguls like Steve Tisch and Josh Harris. There's public officials in the UK like Prince Andrew and the Crown Princess of Norway. And there's also multiple powerful women that met Epstein or at least had dinner with him, including Martha Stewart, Katie Couric, and even Mira Nair, Zohran Mamdani's mother, who's a filmmaker. And to be clear, not every single person who was named is guilty, but it just speaks to how well connected this guy was. He seemingly knew everyone with fame and power, and for some reason, powerful people who were privy to his crimes went out of their way to cover his ass, and it's bizarre. For example, Kathy Rumler, who served as White House counsel for Barack Obama before becoming the CEO of Goldman Sachs, was giving Epstein advice back in 2016 while she was still part of the Obama administration, by the way, about how to respond to possible questions about then candidate Donald Trump having sex with underage girls. And instead of hauling Trump's ass in for questioning when they had power, the Obama administration decided to sit on this information that Epstein was willingly giving them about Donald Trump, because they probably knew that Democrats like Bill Clinton, as well as their donors like Reid Hoffman, would also be implicated as well. So powerful people, they all kept their mouths shut for decades, presumably because they knew that speaking up would lead to their mutually assured destruction. You can't really tattle on Republicans without implicating Democrats as well, and vice versa. So they all kept quiet about the worst crimes imaginable. So we're learning in real time about an actual cabal, pay attention to QAnon, of well-connected elites who either raped children themselves or didn't say anything about the child rape that they knew was happening to protect their own asses in some way, shape, or form, or protect people that they were close to. And every single individual, regardless if they were a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, needs to be investigated if they were named here and brought to justice if they committed a crime or withheld information about crimes that they knew were happening. And when you step back and really think about all of this, the Epstein files sheds light on the mentality of people in power, the sheer sociopathy of public officials who all defended a live stream genocide in Gaza for the past 2.5 years. We were all watching in our homes in horror as Israel slaughtered thousands of children every single day, and we couldn't fathom how politicians around the world could support such atrocities with enthusiasm. But now we know that it's not just because of corruption and influence peddling by the likes of AIPAC and the Israel lobby. It is the result of a widespread disregard for the well-being of children that elites have normalized among their inner circles. It's a genuine sickness that should shake every single person to their core. These people are psychopaths. And, this might sound a little bit conspiratorial, but it does feel like something more sinister is going on that we still haven't uncovered yet. There's evidence that Jeffrey Epstein was a foreign asset, possibly worked for Mossad, who blackmailed powerful people at the behest of the governments that he might have worked for, and that possibly, could include Russia as well, although there's more evidence for Israel, but that still doesn't explain the full extent of his reach. And that's what I really want to hone in on today in this video, because we're well aware of the most odious crimes that he committed, but Jeffrey Epstein was also able to presumably mold entire industries and influence public discourse in profound, world-changing ways. And simply being well-connected and a possible intelligence agent, it still doesn't quite explain how he was able to do all of this. Case in point, as The Gamer reports, Jeffrey Epstein was apparently a huge cheerleader for microtransactions in video games, the very thing that arguably ruined gaming. James Lucas reports, in newly uncovered correspondence between Epstein, futurist Pablo Holman, and former Activision CEO Bobby Kotick, taken from the over 3 million Epstein files that were released on Friday, conversations were had about, quote, indoctrinating kids into an economy through in-game cosmetics. X Prize is a good idea, but key is real-world rewards, Kotick said in an email to Epstein. Learn to read, earn cell phone minutes, iPhone credits, virtual items in games. Interestingly, these emails were sent on May 3rd of 2013, mere months after Black Ops 2 launched, the first game in the series to feature microtransactions. Activision tested the waters with personalization packs, extra slot packs, and paid calling cards, the first of which released on April 12th, 2013. Call of Duty Ghosts, which launched later that year, went even further with paid special characters, voiceover packs, skins, camos, and even weapons. It's not hard to draw a line between these conversations with Epstein and industry figures and the sudden boom in microtransactions that occurred around the same time period, but what's most concerning is the apparent interest to normalize aggressive monetization strategies towards younger audiences, as suggested in remarks made by Epstein's associates in the DOJ documents. Since this happened, gaming has become even more hyper-commodified to the point where AAA game studios are nickel and diming customers in every conceivable way. Like, they're getting getting creative with how greedy they are. They're not just selling cosmetics these days to gamers. They're charging for access to portions of games, and they're deliberately designing some games to be overly tedious to coerce gamers into buying upgrades that'll accelerate their progression. It's just disgusting. And Epstein didn't single-handedly create this trend, obviously, seeing as how microtransactions already existed long before he hyped them up in that email and after Call of Duty had already implemented them for the first time. But it's not unreasonable to assume that maybe he influenced Bobby Kotick to make them at least a little bit more predatory in the next Call of Duty, seeing as how he was a financier after all. Oh, and he was also encouraged to invest in Activision 5 years later, where he's told by Paul Barrett, sounds like they have successfully integrated the Battle Royale Fortnite format into the latest Call of Duty game. And Bobby Kotick, the CEO of Activision at the time, who was talking to Epstein, was also named in the Epstein files hundreds of times, and you might not be too surprised to find out that he was also covering up sexual misconduct at the highest levels of his company for years. So it's no surprise that a creep like him would also be drawn to somebody like Jeffrey Epstein, but the plot thickens even further when it comes to Jeffrey Epstein and video games, believe it or not, because he also helped to indirectly cultivate the regressive, hyper-reactionary gaming culture that's ubiquitous on the internet these days. And I say this because journalist Ryan Broderick, who's followed the rise of the far-right's infiltration of male-dominated spaces on the internet for years, explains how Jeffrey Epstein played a role in radicalizing young men. He writes, based on the documents we have access to, these were twin obsessions for Epstein, manipulating what we see online and finding digital alternatives to traditional finance, i.e. crypto. During the last years of his life, these two ideas would dovetail into one project, building a far-right takeover of Europe with Steve Bannon. Bannon first enters the picture when Epstein took an interest in World of Warcraft. Epstein was close with Brock Pierce, cryptocurrency entrepreneur who co-founded the stablecoin Tether. In 2001, Pierce founded Internet Gaming Entertainment, or IGE, a company that tried to build a trading market for in-game currency for video games like WoW. In 2007, Pierce was replaced at IGE by Bannon, and in November of 2016, Epstein's longtime accountant, Richard Kahn, emailed Epstein a Wired article about Bannon's role at IGE. In-game currency especially was a fixation for him. He emailed former Activision CEO Bobby Kotick in May 2013 a long diatribe about using virtual items in in-game currency to co-opt the existing video game industry and replace traditional education. He seemed to think you could inspire kids to learn better by gamifying it. Now let's pause right there because we're circling back to Epstein's successful co-optation of the video game industry, and the timeline here is really important. So prior to his role with Call of Duty's microtransactions, Epstein was already paying individuals to manage his online perception, especially after his 2008 conviction for soliciting prostitution of a child. Now, based on the emails that we've seen, it does seem like Epstein really was obsessed with manipulating online discourse too, as Broderick reported. Now, around 2011, Epstein took particular interest in 4chan, and its creator, Christopher Poole, aka Moot, shut down its politics board after it became a safe haven for Nazis. So he made the right decision, but then, conspicuously around a year later, he brought it back despite knowing the danger that it posed to the public. Now, Broderick explains, it has never made much sense as to why Pool would ban New for being a racist hellhole, and then barely a year later, launch Poll, which stands for politically incorrect, a board specifically designed to be a racist hellhole. But buried inside the newest batch of files related to the Epstein investigation is a possible hint as to what made Pool change his mind. He met with Epstein the day before Poll was created. And that's quite the coincidence, is it not? So Epstein somehow presumably got Moot to bring back this Nazi forum for some reason, and would you look at that, it took off. Now, maybe it happened organically, maybe Epstein played a role in making it more popular, we have no idea. But what we do know is what happened after this Nazi forum came back. White supremacist memes from this 4chan board ended up gaining popularity, especially after they trickled down to Reddit and Facebook. Edgy, racist memes and anti-Semitic memes and homophobic and transphobic memes became really popular, especially in online spaces dominated by young men. Think Pepe the Frog circa 2015 and whatnot. And this board found other ways to galvanize young men by popularizing anti-SJW sentiment and even launched Gamergate, which was when the floodgates to online reactionary content just like burst open. But other nefarious actors also took Gamergate to the next level by mainstreaming it, and that includes Steve Bannon's website. Broderick continues, in March of 2012, Steve Bannon, following the death of conservative blogger Andrew Breitbart, was installed as the editor-in-chief of Breitbart News. In 2014, 4chan's video game board V and Poll started lighting up about the Gamergate conspiracy theory. Milo Yiannopoulos, then a young tech writer for Breitbart, would transform Gamergate from fringe message board drama into the cornerstone of the global far-right movement by repackaging it in articles optimized for Facebook traffic, which was perfect timing because Epstein was beginning to work his way into Silicon Valley. And that branches off into an entirely different story where Epstein infiltrated tech circles and got close to Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, and he even offered to help pay for Thiel's lawsuit against Gawker. I believe he encouraged the former prime minister of Israel to get in bed with Palantir. There's a lot there, but that's a different story for a different day. But to go back to 2011, Epstein helped unleash 4chan's Nazi board on the public. And it was a boon for right-wing operatives like Steve Bannon. So we're starting to kind of see the origins of the modern online far-right movement and how both Epstein and Bannon played very crucial roles. But it wasn't until 2017 that Epstein and Bannon would actually meet for the first time once journalist Michael Wolff connected them. Now, the context is important here because you've got Epstein, who is a pedophile who wants to control what we see on the internet, and then you've got Steve Bannon, an architect of the modern white supremacist movement who facilitated Trump's rise to power, and they both came together to do some evil. Specifically, they wanted to crush the Me Too movement, which was popping off at the time. Quote, the two men brainstormed how to use cryptocurrency to fund a populist nationalist coalition that could stave off Time's Up, this is Me Too, for the next decade plus. And it seems like both Bannon and Epstein had already independently figured out the perfect place to build that coalition, 4chan. And as we now know, their coalition was indeed very, very successful. And side note, in 2018, after they formed this coalition, Bannon was trying to help Jeffrey Epstein rehabilitate his image. He wanted to crush the pedo myth. You can read this in the emails, and talked about how they needed to get people to not view Jeffrey Epstein as a monster and rather to view him as a human. So Bannon was trying to stage the comeback for Jeffrey Epstein. So they were working hand in hand. But to get back to the coalition, that coalition that they built appears to be the catalyst for the universalization of the global fascist movement that still exists today. With Epstein's connections to world leaders and Bannon's internet savvy, they were able to plant the seeds of fascism around the world and watched it grow. Now, Bannon gained a foothold in the UK and in Germany, France, and Hungary, and he started advising their fascist politicians and helping their movements grow as well. And in the newly released Epstein files, we do get a glimpse of how Bannon worked with Epstein behind the scenes to foster this global fascist movement that they built together. Broderick writes, in July of 2018, Epstein told Bannon that he was wrestling with how to get a team of hackers for Bannon and wanted to use a zero-day exploit to target crypto wallets and voting booths. And in another email that month, Epstein also alleged that Marine Le Pen's far-right Front National Party was financed by Russia. And over the next 6 months, the men continued to scheme with each other over text. In March of 2019, Rod Larson texted Epstein, trying to lift Shinzo Abe on world stage as key to Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro, Orbán Salvini. And Epstein texted Bannon, now at the pyramid, referring to the Louvre pyramid, with the entire government. What are your plans? So they were very clearly trying to nurture a global fascist movement that is still very much prominent till this day. And the wind under their sails was an online campaign of manipulation, specifically of young men, that emanated from 4chan, as we now know. And as is the case with all things Epstein-related, we're barely even scratching the surface because there's so much there. Epstein also invested in technology that helped Russia, whose internet research agency also manipulated people online, mostly at the behest of Donald Trump in the lead up to the 2016 election. But we don't know if he had any role with that operation or other foreign operations. Just there's so many fucking questions that it's making my head spin. But we might never know the full extent of the online manipulation that Epstein played a role in, but we can say with certainty that reactionary gaming channels that feed into anti-woke outrage to this day, like The Quartering, Geeks and Gamers, and others, they all owe their success to Jeffrey Epstein. He paved the path for them. The 4chanification of right-wing politics is a direct result of Jeffrey Epstein. And it's convenient for the Epstein class that right-wing reactionaries get their audiences to fixate on niche gaming-related culture war issues, since that's a really nice distraction from the ways that the Epstein class is robbing the rest of us blind. In fact, I would take it a step further and say that most right-wing influencers today, not just the gamer ones, arguably owe their entire careers to Jeffrey Epstein, because had he not intervened to get Moot to resurrect the politics board, which drives so much right-wing discourse online, there might have never been a lane for these grifters to exist in the first place. And ironically, these same people who championed the release of the Epstein files are now either downplaying Trump's role in it, or they're just pretending like they don't see all of the headlines that we're all seeing for obvious reasons. You know who I'm talking about, the Alex Joneses and the libs of TikToks of the world who thinks every single LGBTQ plus person ever is a groomer, but apparently the president that she supports is totally innocent. So the rabbit hole goes so much deeper than any of us thought, and the more we learn, the more questions we have. But at least we now know for sure why Donald Trump and the Republican Party fought so hard to stop the release of the Epstein files. Our suspicion was right. We were correct to trust our guts. It's because they're all over that shit, all of the elites. And if they're not directly implicated themselves, powerful people that donate to them or otherwise have them by the balls are implicated. So if the DOJ is willing to release all of this, I can't imagine what they're still keeping from us.